time for architecture, coffee, and ink. Hello, this is Hollywood C, and you're listening to Architecture, Coffee, and Ink, a podcast dedicated to introducing concepts, detailing out designs, and tackling the architecture you might not realize the meaning behind. I'm your hostess, and I am here today to start introducing you to the designs that make you wonder why. So I ask you to brew your coffee, grab your sketchbook and pen, and let's begin. Hello, everyone, or should I say rabbit rabbit if you happen to have downloaded this episode before getting out of bed this morning. Apparently, that's supposed to be good luck if you say it at the start of a new month. I don't know about everyone else, but I was feeling like I was struggling to adjust into the new year, and then finally got just the right level of napping in over the weekend that now I'm ready to tackle it all. I have been struggling with the blog account, and now that that is all finally fixed and ready to go, I can start changing it around and uploading the missing posts from last week and this one later this afternoon. As well as finally finishing up and finishing off updating my portfolios and websites. With me graduating in May, it seems like there is so much that you want to include, and scaling down is always the hardest to do. Plus, I personally love to continue to update drawings and portfolios as I go, because the me who walked through the door 4 years ago, having never touched Photoshop, to the me now who literally cannot imagine a day without some form of sketching, are very, very different people. But finally settling down into a routine and finishing up unpacking my winter move means I can start to live again, and what better way than to start tackling some of the follow-up episodes and requests and planning and researching bonus episodes when I need a small break from my pieces. But for this week, we are going to pick back up where we left off and follow up on the interview with Gage Manuel from last week, where he spoke to us about paper mills. Some of you emailed to request the follow-up as you are interested in the history of the paper mill itself and how the building structure has evolved over time, as well as look at the ups and downsides. So first, I'll start by quoting myself exactly from last week. Quote, "A paper mill is a factory devoted to making paper, including toilet paper, stationery, and cardboard, depending upon the individual location and the needs of the community and resources." And I will again add on to this very basic definition that it includes the capital and the economics. Later on in the episode, we are actually going to be discussing a case study of a paper mill that no longer exists. Before we start, I again want to disclaimer, you should always check your sources, check your facts, and more importantly, check me. I should never be your primary and only source of information. The major modern problem with the word paper mill, and goodness, I still forget no one can see me and I totally just used air quotes, is that it is actually used extremely loosely. In academia, you have definitely heard of paper mills before, but normally it's referring to the fake paper websites. So for those who don't know and aren't sitting around grading papers in their spare time, there are places you can get illegal and falsified papers with fabricated stories called paper mills. And no, I am not referring to the ones that students purchase, though that is a small part of it. These papers are actually extremely dangerous. They provide false and harmful information indiscriminately. So oftentimes you'll hear the phrase paper mill associated with this idea of misinformation. Now, normally these aren't an actual location. You can get them online at your website. There's no students going to street corners. But when you get to into the actual factories I am referring to, this idea of misinformation or harm doesn't go away. And in some regards, I think that the original practices undoubtedly strengthen that connection. Paper mills also have an issue of being a catch-all term that can include human, animal, and water-powered mills. As you have most likely guessed, the power source comes from exactly what is stated: humans providing the power, animals providing the power, and water providing the power. As Gage stated, the location is one of the most important aspects of determining where they place the mills and what type of power source is going to be used. So before I start into the history of paper mills, I'm going to backtrack slightly into the history of paper making as a whole, then slide into paper mills, and finally conclude with some of the machinery in the case study. Because human-powered mills actually ties way back into the origins of paper itself. Paper originates as far back as 105 AD and was credited to Pasai Lun or Kai Lun, who lived from 62 CE to 121 in China. He was a eunuch who served under Emperor Hidai of the Donghan dynasty, and during his time at court, he came up with the idea of using bark and other materials to create paper. It is actually the same person, it's just one name was Romanized. As they were originally writing on silks and stones, this idea of using a lighter, cheaper material took off. Eventually, it ended up spreading across the trading routes, and you can trace the introduction of paper and when it was used in each new area pretty clearly across the routes from what I was looking at. However, the issues begin pretty quickly, as often is the case with a new invention, not intervention, sorry. While the idea and concept of printing helped paper take off, materials were needed. The original methods used rags and waste in addition to the barks, so it wasn't until the 1800s that the idea of wood pulp was introduced. The name paper actually comes from papyrus, like the plant. Using the leaves, the Egyptians used it to create their writing materials. They're honestly very beautiful plants to look at. I'll see if I can find a picture for the blog, but fingers crossed on that. Here is where my sources get a little bit fuzzy. So when I was reading up on this, I got several sources to mention a book was published that launched forward paper making, and some that made it sound like it was the first to be published on the wood pulp method, and several different sources made it seem like it was a manual about the process of paper making. But when I attempted to find it, I could only find 2 books about religion being credited as the first to be printed on a machine-made paper or wood pulp paper. I am 100% certain that this is a question I could eventually answer, but it would take a lot longer than the few weeks I spent researching this episode. So let me tentatively promise to see if I can get back to it later, because I really didn't want to push this episode back. But my current research led me to believe that in 1802, a book titled, and this is a long one, quote, "The Mathematical and Philosophical Works of the Right Rev. John Wilkins, late Lord Bishop of Chester," end quote, was credited to be the first book on wood pulp paper. While a second book, quote, "An abstract of the whole doctrine of the Christian religion with observations from a manuscript in Her Majesty's possession, the first book stereotyped by the new process," end quote, is credited with being the first to be printed from a Stanhope press. The reason I bring that up is that there is only one manual about the process that I was able to find, and it wasn't published until after that. So the first book was credited to be published in wood pulp in 1802, the second in 1804, and the pamphlets, I am guessing, of the new process that revolutionized the world in 1806. So, if so, it explains why some of the sources just threw in 1800 and added an S at the end. It seems like a lot of nuances and miswritten articles, and that's completely ignoring Mathis Coops, who held the patent for recycled paper, something that was issued around April 28th, 1800 even, for patent number 2392. But again, why do we as architects, designers, or just you, dear listeners, care? Because with that change in the process came a change in the needs and the demands on space involved to make paper. Paper mills themselves were believed to be human and animal powered for the earliest versions, and switched later on to the water-based power. It seems that the references were pretty scattered, so I will only mention the definitive ones and skim through the history, because this topic is complicated enough on its own and doesn't need my help muddling the waters. Human and animal powered were definitely known to be used by both Muslims and Chinese first, including a reference to one in Baghdad in 1794. Unlike those, water powered seems to be pretty elusive to pin down. I'm not saying that they didn't have them, but it's more that all of my sources contradicted themselves, and it seemed that they argued against each other. And I even checked out the Wikipedia page and sources. I'm guessing from reading that there is a translation issue at play. It seems like some refer to them as industries or give them titles. Unfortunately, the languages that the original documents and references are in are not ones that I speak or read, so I can't offer any insights on these 11th century documents. If someone does know, please reach out. I would love to speak with someone who has studied the original text. But in 1282, with the Kingdom of Aragon, we can start documenting the incorporation of water-powered mills officially, meaning that a new limitation of designs is the proximity of water. But from there, we see the first stirrings of the Fordrini machines, which is the paper machines that you can see on YouTube videos today. In fact, I actually included a link for a video of one of the machines working, or its current modern equivalent, that I will be posting on the blog episode. The original was patented in 1799 by Nicholas Robert and installed on behalf of the brothers Henry and Seeley Fordrini, where it will evolve over the years until it becomes the modern day machine that it is now. There is 4 sections to the machine: a wet end, a wet press section, a calendar section, which is located at the end, and a dryer section. As you may have guessed, the process takes the materials, gets it moist and into paste, presses it into the sheets you expect, and then dries and finishes it with a gloss. There's much more to the process, but because of the vastness of all the topics being covered today, I'm keeping it kind of light and sticking with the basics. Gage did a great job explaining the paper mills and production, so please go back to the previous episode. We're on a roll with an interview of a paper maker. He chose the title of the episode. Instead, I'm going to move on to the social impacts of the industry, as my Spark Notes history into the previous 2 topics has taken up enough of everyone's time. Like any industry, there are some places that do it great and attempt to mitigate the impact they have, and in others, they exploit and degrade both the workers and the environment. Some of the worst in the world are removing native populations and creating, quote, green deserts, or monocultures of farming that offer little to no positive give back to the environment. Some remove livelihoods simply by revoking access and habitat to animals in areas that were traditionally used by locals. Health-wise, mills have historically been a source of chlorine, bleaching, mercury, lead, phosphorus, among other heavy metals. While steps are being taken to remove these and starting to regulate the process, the previous chemicals can cause reproductive issues, allergies, and attack the immune and endocrine systems. That being said, I did mention last week how some families were completely dependent on the mill for employment, a sentiment that was confirmed by my guest. I think that the discussion last episode highlighted what a socially responsible company looks like. Gage mentioned how they're giving back to the community and attempting to give back extra energy and the safety steps and practices used. I won't repeat the whole conversation, but please go back and listen, especially if you want to learn more about how they are recycling the materials and processes of that. There have been multiple legislation at various levels introduced across the world to improve the processes, and I encourage you to research on your own to find out as much as possible about both sides of the issue. Unfortunately, with the length of the episodes, I won't have time to talk about it, but a paper was written that I included among the sources that did a, quote, 50-state analysis, end quote, on economic contribution. If you get the chance and are interested in jump-starting your own research, it might not be a bad starting point. Now, finally, we are going to be talking about the most important part, the case study. So I'm going to be talking about the Brown Company, in part because they closed, but mostly because the history stretches from 1852 until 1980. The story begins in Portland, Maine, and moves to the final location of Berlin, New Hampshire, where the headquarters would eventually end up. The firm was originally founded underneath John B. Brown, Josiah S. Little, Ezekiel Winslow, and Nathan Winslow. From the original founding, they eventually incorporated a railway, dam, and grist mill. Originally, this was underneath the group of people, including John B. Brown and William Wentworth Brown, who would later gain complete control of the company, eventually causing the name of the company to shift from H. Winslow and Company to Berlin Mills Company, and finally the Brown Company in 1917. Eventually, the company went bankrupt in the 40s, which led to the eventual selling of the company to the James River Corporation. But the company is actually responsible for several different products over its time, including the most famous to me, the Nibrock paper towels. Don't recognize the name? You should. They are the first type of paper towels and originally were sold to be placed into little metal containers you could mount on the walls of bathrooms so you can pull it out the bottom. Nibrock is actually Corbin, the inventor's last name is spelled backwards, but you can still order them from the Gorham Paper and Tissue Company, among others. However, the Gorham is actually one of the original locations of the Brown Company that was just split and sold when the rest of the company was. The other reason I picked this location is that Plymouth State University and a few others have a digital archives of almost 11,000 photos, all at the request of a professor on campus. I'm including a link on the blog so you can see the various mills that they had, which stretched all the way up into Canada, as well as the aerials of the plants and interiors. It will show you a look across multiple years, which I think is more invaluable than me describing the entire collection to you photo by photo. The photos are in a documentary as well, I believe, as well as just readily available on the internet. I figured that in light of the abstract topics I covered today, finishing with a well-documented case study was just what the doctor ordered. Now, amongst the other things that are shown in the digital collections, one of the aspects was that the company actually in between the bankruptcy in the 40s and the eventual selling off of the company in the 80s, they actually spent a lot of time going into research. So you'll see that among the digital collections, there will be some things like the pages of the impurities in the Western hemlock samples, and there'll be lab results. There'll also be charts of expenditure reports and procedures. They'll have building interiors and exteriors. So the reason I really chose this study is that it's so much information readily available. And given that this is a topic that some people understand a lot and some people don't understand at all, this I felt was a nice median of a lot of work and dedication, as well as a lot of information. They even have pollution tests. And if you can hear my mouse clicking, I'm very sorry for that. I'm going to try to get rid of it. But as I'm looking through the machine, looking through all of the images, you can see the people at work, you can see the different levels of machines. It's just an amazing level of information that they've managed to collect. And what I like is I didn't have to sign in to anything to get to this. This is just readily available information. And there's like a series of different collections available that you can do this. You can actually just like click through the collections and see all of the information. And personally, I love when you can find a photo with handwritten notes. For example, they're like writing about this particular one's talking about like unloading from a drag sled or whatever, but you can see the individual detailed handwritten additions to the papers. And to me, that really makes it all worthwhile in the long run. Now, among the other achievements and inventions and products, there's also Cream Crisp. So this might be a lesser known. I'm not sure how many people enjoy Crisco, but there actually was a lawsuit that eventually came through. And if you end up looking into it, so Crisco is, I personally don't use a lot of it, but it is like a type of shortening, and the case is called the Procter and Gamble versus the Brown Company. So this was when the company was underneath the Brown name, and you can actually go, they have like a written transcript of the entire thing. It was actually argued in February 13th, 1967, and decided April 11th, 1967. So this was done during the eventual decline of the company. Other products was, raw peanut oil. They manufactured that for a while. They did powder containers for weapons during the Second World War. Peanut flakes, what used to be a breakfast cereal. I don't think you can still get that anymore. I genuinely don't know. I'm gonna have to figure that out. No, I don't think you can get those anymore. Anyway, as well as an artificial leather that's normally used for shoes. So they did have their own little store as well at some point, and I couldn't figure out if this was actually attached to the mill or if it was slightly separate from it. But they did eventually try to, before they sold after their bankruptcy, they did try to branch off into the Everglades for a little bit, and you'll see some dirt samples as well online for that. They're just kind of section cut, little square cuts of it. But the documentary is actually called At River's Edge, an Oral History of Berlin, New Hampshire. Once the company was sold, the Brown family had actually long since lost ownership of the company at that point. So it was changed, but if you look online, you can actually find a bunch of stories and descriptions from people who used to live and work there, and then their parents used to live and work there. And it was a lot like what we talked about with my personal people I knew and family, and then also what Gage talked about with his family as well, that it was a lot more to them than just an industry, but a way of life and a way of forming connections within the community. So one of the things that they did was a Telling Their Stories project, and they were talking about how they lived there and the different stories of people who lived in the region. But regardless of whether or not you take a moment to look through the different sources, there is another source online that I also wanted to point out as well. So I did have a few sources that I have included about the environmental effects. And one of the environmental papers that I had shows both the worst practice and the best practicing firms. And it makes sure to acknowledge both sides of the argument, as well as it does a really good job of introducing ideas and concepts and discussing some of the different litigation that has been put into place about the industry. And so I think one of the biggest points that they try to drive is talking about recycling, as well as the economic industries being distributed across multiple different fronts. A lot of the times with mills, it's not just affecting just the mill itself and the family immediately around it. A lot of them directly tie into logging and paper industries and stationaries and notebooks. I think I joked in one of our first episodes that I have 1,000,000 notebooks that I will keep for the rest of my life. But I would personally encourage you all to also reuse, renew, and recycle. But once again, a big thank you to all my listeners. I know I say this every week, but please rate and review. If you liked it, loved it, hate it, let me know. I love feedback and hearing from everyone, and more importantly, sparking conversations. We have a Facebook page and private group, both of which are under the same name, Architecture, Coffee, and Ink, which is again a pretty young podcast. Our website is architectureinc.design.blog, and everything will be linked in the show notes. I will be posting the transcript and some images on the blog later in the afternoon, and since I have finally conquered all of the electronic devices around me, I'm super excited to post other things as well. This weekend, look out for another episode. I'm going to be posting just a couple of bonus episodes and exploring my freedom while I still have it. But I have been promising some bonus episodes, and I'm going to finally deliver. So keep an eye out for that. But as always, may your coffee mugs be full and your inkwells never run dry.